Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this NRCOP webinar of Regulators as Raters. I'm Tracy Mackey, the Commissioner for the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission, and I'm joined by some fantastic panellists and a bunch of enthusiastic regulators in the room, and we're here at the University of New South Wales CBD campus in Sydney. So I'd like to very much start by recognising that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects and honour all First Peoples that have come before us, and make sure that we recognise all of the lands on which, particularly those joining us online, pay tribute to all of the elders there as well. Before I introduce our speakers, there's a few points I'd like to make around this being a webinar. So I'd like to let you know that we record these webinars and they are available on the ANZSOG YouTube channel anytime to share with your teams, perhaps after the event. We also, after the events, do some short clips of key points so that you can access those and share those across social media channels, both internally and externally in your organisations. And today we'll be using the Q&A function on Zoom. So they're going to pop up here on the screen in front of me. If you like a question that someone's posed, please give it an upvote so that we know that there's particular interest in that question, and we'll try and get to as many of the questions as possible. Those questions that we can't get to, we'll try and get you some written responses after the session today. We are going to try and keep to time, and that'll give us as much as possible opportunity to get through as many questions as we can, because this is all about you as regulators having an opportunity to hear from each other, share with each other, and hopefully prompt some learnings. Today's session about regulators as raters is going to explore some very fundamental questions on the role of us as regulators and how we might be able to influence behaviour change. I was very keen for us to do this session as a regulator of a number of entities. The current one I'm responsible for at the NDIS Commission, we don't have ratings, yet we have a population that we're there to safeguard and ensure quality services and supports for, where it would make a huge difference for them to understand what good looks like and whether or not the service that they're choosing is actually a good choice for them. So today's session, I'm really interested in hearing more about some of the key elements or levers that we can use as a regulator to inform a rating system, and also how it might make it easier for the consumer or the client, or in my case, the person with a disability, to find what is a good service, what is a good option for them to choose. So let me introduce my esteemed panel next to me. I'll introduce them both in the order in which they'll be speaking. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Gabrielle Sinclair, who is the CEO of ASIQA. And for those of you, it is a test, that acronym. So the Australian Children's Education and Care Quality Authority. And Gabrielle has held a number of senior positions, particularly across the Queensland Government, across education, infrastructure, planning, local government and corrective services. But she has been in the CEO chair for quite a few years now, and comes with a wealth of knowledge around early childhood education, having been the Deputy Director General for Early Childhood and Community Engagement in Queensland immediately prior. And then we also have Andrew Davies, who's the Manager of the Local Government Unit in the New South Wales Food Authority. Andrew's worked in regulation for more than 20 years, both here in Australia and in the UK, and he joined the Food Authority in 2014 as a compliance officer before stepping into the manager role. In this role, he oversees the Food Regulation Partnership, which is a formal agreement between the Food Authority and other food enforcement agencies, such as local councils, to regulate the food and food retail sectors. So welcome to my fellow panel members. I'm now going to hand over to Gabrielle, who's going to take us through what ratings look like as a regulator across the early childhood education sphere.
Okay, thanks so much, Tracy. And when I was thinking of this hot topic, I thought to put in a frame of what a CEQA does, I put in what I considered the 5 C's. So for every regulator, there has to be a context to regulating. You have to have components of, what are you regulating and why. Certainly, there has to be some clear objectives. If you're going to start rating anything, you need to have a fairly good idea of what you want to achieve. And of course, the criteria for evaluation. And so, and the last one, of course, as Tracy said, we only rate because we want to have informed consumers. And whether they're consumers or recipients or clients or children, in our case, in families, we want to make sure that they're really well informed, and so that they are able to make the choices that best suit, in our instance, their children and their family. So of course, I'll always start, I missed out at one, as you always do. This morning I woke up and I thought, of course, there's choice. Let's forget rating if there's no choice, because what's the point? So in the National Quality Framework, it began over a decade ago. Before the National Quality Framework was agreed to by the 9 governments of Australia, every state and territory had their own system of approvals, monitoring, compliance. It was quite one of those serendipitous moments where 9 governments decided it might be great to have a national approach. And so the National Quality Framework was conceived, and I have to say, every day I'm incredibly impressed by the creators of the National Quality Framework, because rating is just one component of that quality framework. And I have to acknowledge states and territories are the employers of authorised officers who do the rating as well as the compliance checking, as well as the approvals. They've got a holistic role in terms of their relationship with the 17,500 approved services we have in Australia for early childhood education and outside schoolhouse care. The context for us, of course, is that we have to learn a lot from every other sector and every other system. The National Quality Framework is in the context that we're an education sector. And so the consumer is also the 9 governments of Australia, because, as you all know, there is a significant amount of public money put into subsidising early childhood education and care to make it more affordable to families. So governments too want to know how the system is working, whether they're getting a good return on their investment, and quite rightly too. So the rating system, the challenges that we've got, and we've got some questions. When I talk about evaluation, the National Quality Framework is based on a principle and an objective that there's continuous quality improvement. And that's not just for the 17,500 services, it's also for the 9 governments, and it's also for a CEQA as the independent body established to really monitor how the National Quality Framework is progressing and is being implemented. And part of our role is to make sure, and some of the questions on that little notes up there, one of our roles is to train authorised officers, because you can't have a rating system unless it's reliable, truthful, responsive, and informative. Because if the consumer loses, I guess, trust that the rating system actually is factual, then what's the point? There's a lot of money to save if you decide not to become a rater. And we learnt that the hard way, because all of the 9 governments of Australia, when they agreed to set up the National Quality Framework, one of the new things that they brought in, besides a fabulous body like a CEQA, they brought in the rating, which we hadn't done before. And the rating system is one of those challenging systems that every Australian expects that their early childhood education and care service, or where they're going to eat their food, is good, and it's safe, and it's high quality. Everyone accepts that, and everyone just assumes that. And so when we say to people, do you know about the rating system for early childhood? They go, no, what's that? And that's been our biggest challenge, is how do we make sure that they understand that there's another bit of information that they can use to make their choices, and also to demand better quality. And that's the dynamic of of having a rating system. I was in the movies yesterday watching Barbie, as you do. Classification system came up. How long has that classification system been in place in Australia that every time a movie is played, it comes up to remind the audience about the choices they're going to make? And 10 years down the track, we're still struggling to help every mum and dad, new mum and dad, to know that there's a rating system on Starting Blocks, which is our website that we created especially for families, that they can go in there and they can look at the 7 elements that make up quality, and they can really be well informed. But as I said, when there's only one service in their town, of course, we still say, be aware of the rating system and help your service to improve in quality. The challenge for us, of course, is that Ofsted have had a rating system for schools and early childhood for quite a long time. And, we weren't getting traction. It seemed that not an awful lot of Australians knew that there was a rating system for early childhood education and care. They knew that where their service was because they spoke to the family next door, but they didn't know that there was a rating system. And when I contacted Ofsted and I said, how do we do it? How did you guys do it? And they said, we start afresh every year. And that's what our challenge is, that every year we have to start afresh, and we have to do a campaign, and we have to help parents to know that they can be well informed. They can really make sure if the quality of their service, even if there's only one, isn't that great, they know that these are the components, the 7 components of quality in the National Quality Framework. It's called the National Quality Standard. And they know that they can demand of their service that the service does better, because every child deserves it.
You've come in under time, Gabrielle.
Well done.
Didn't even have to.
I get a rating for that.
All right, Andrew, let's hear about food safety standards.
Sure, no problem at all. We've got a slide. Thank you very much. My name's Andrew. I work for New South Wales Food Authority. I'm going to talk to you about Scores on Doors. I'll quickly talk about what the Scores on Doors programme is, why we have it in place, and also the benefits that we see from the programme as well. And a lot of the terminology and the concepts that Gabrielle has introduced we'll mirror and build on as well. Next slide, please. So just a bit of context for you. Food regulation in New South Wales, working together. We've got the New South Wales Food Authority. We're based at Newington, Western Sydney. And we have a formal partnership called the Food Regulation Partnership, and that's with all 128 local councils in New South Wales. We also partner with Lord Howe Island Board for Lord Howe Island, would you believe? And also in terms of the Kosciuszko National Park, it's the National Park and Wildlife Service, who operates under the Department of Planning and Environment as well. Can we just go back to the earlier slide there? Just the sole purpose of what we do, despite the fact we've got the Food Standards Code and the Food Act, number one, we want to ensure that food produced and served in New South Wales is safe to eat. And you had the comment earlier, all consumers would expect when they go out to eat from a mobile food van, at a temporary event, at a kebab shop at 4 o'clock in the morning. The food is going to be safe to eat, and that's the sole purpose of why we have that partnership in place. Next slide, please. So Scores on what? So Scores on Doors, it was introduced as a pilot in 2010 to test the concept, and it was ultimately rolled out in 2012 because of the feedback that was received. And what is it? Hopefully you've got some recognition of the certificate there. They have changed slightly. There is an older version as well. But effectively what it is, it's a visual presentation of the food standards inspection that is currently undertaken. So we're in the retail sector. So you've got your cafes, your restaurants, your bars, all these places that serve food to consumers. And the business is scored against a checklist, standardised checklist, which marries the food standards code. Each business is then given a score that's based on their performance using that inspection form. And then if the local council has adopted the scheme, then it's quite a simple process. If the food business is scored well, then they would get an excellent as an example. But there's other gradings as well, which we'll go into in just a moment. The visuals there are quite important, I believe, because it gives the business the opportunity to really promote outstanding or good performance, or strong performance. And we found since the COVID restrictions, there was an increased focus on health and hygiene. Consumers far more wary of, in those days, masks, using the creams and the wipes and making sure that everything was clean, and cutlery was taken away and replaced. So there does seem to be far more focus on that now, so a little bit more awareness. Again, just for context, it is a voluntary system. We don't enforce that on local councils to adopt. We haven't gone down that mandatory option, which could be something for us to consider in the future, but at the moment, it's still a voluntary programme. We cover about 63% of food businesses in New South Wales, and that's about 59 local councils, as reported to us 2022. Next slide, please. So what do we seek to achieve from the scheme? Number one, improved compliance. So as I said, our main goal is to ensure that the food that you eat is safe to eat, and that links to high compliance. So you see there, when the Food Regulation Partnership was established back in 2008, 2009, there's a kind of upward trajectory there in relation to compliance. As it stands today, it's about 98% compliance in the retail sector. So that's number one. What we want to do is to enhance that compliance level, because again, we don't want people to get sick. And again, please. We also want to reduce foodborne illness. So what that means is we want people to not be getting sick from eating food. That's quite a busy graph for you. I'll very quickly explain it for you. At the bottom, we've got 2008 to 2017. You see the red and the orange line. The orange line represents Australia, the blue line, New South Wales, and that's in respect of Salmonella typhimurium cases presented to hospital. And what you see there is New South Wales and Australia rates kind of mirror each other up until about 2015, where in New South Wales there's quite a reduction there. So less people getting sick from eating food, which is the goal. There's a lot of green boxes there and some information. Scores on Doors is there. If you look at 2011, you could see Scores on Doors as an introduction of that scheme, and as it's rolled out. There are other initiatives there that we've undertaken, so I'm not suggesting Scores on Doors equates to less people getting sick. It's just one measure of many to try and increase compliance, but also to reduce people from getting sick as well. And again, please. So we also seek to achieve improved consistency and transparency with food safety, food surveillance activities. What that means is we've got 128 local councils that are implementing enforcement and compliance activities across the state. So our challenge always is to try and get those inspectors all operating on a consistent basis. We get a lot of food businesses that operate across local government areas, so it's imperative that those businesses have a good awareness and good understanding about what they need to achieve, and that they will get measured fairly across all those different locations as well. But Gabrielle mentioned as well about the consumer side of it as well, and one of our key strategic priorities is to ensure that consumers are informed. Now that can be food labelling, making sure that the food labelling requirements allow consumers to get the information they need. In Australia, we've got quite a high instance of allergens and allergic consumers, as one example as to the type of information that consumers would really need at that pointy end of health and safety. But they also want more information. They want to know what they're eating. They might want to know the nutrition profile of it, the country of origin. There's a host of pieces of information. But what we seek to achieve with Scores on Doors is to give them that informed choice about where they could eat. So if they go to the kebab shop at 4 o'clock and they're very focused on their health and safety, then they can certainly make an informed decision about where they may want to eat or may want to avoid, of course. So we want to provide consumers with useful information with this program as well. And we want it to be easy to recognize and understand. So you go back to the earlier slide where we had an example of the certificate. It says Food Authority on there. It may say the local council on there if they want to co-brand it, but it will have the result, the rating, and the gradings that we have there. So you've got that excellent, which is 5 stars, down to good, which is still perfectly acceptable. It's 3 stars. It's vibrant, it's colourful, and it can be positioned there for the business to promote as they would like as well. The next slide, please. So who benefits from the program? You will have heard me speak already about who would benefit from the program, but I've split it up there. There's incentives for everybody, really. Number one, the regulator. So Food Authority, as an example, who administer and own the program, we can achieve our policy objectives, and that is, as I mentioned earlier, number one, safer food in New South Wales. So we've got increased compliance, we've got reduction in foodborne illness from that busy graph earlier. So we want to achieve that, and this is just one component of how we may deliver that. We also want those clearer choices, so informed consumers who understand, they recognise the system, they recognise the certificate, and they would have the opportunity to make informed decisions as well. So we can achieve some policy objectives via that mechanism as well. It also allows us to strengthen our partnership with local councils. So we've got 128 local councils, as I mentioned. They've all got a different needs, wants, capabilities, capacities across the state. But it gives us an opportunity, if they want to talk to us about Scores on Doors, gives us an opportunity to further bond with them. We have the certificates at the Food Authority and we send them out, usually bulk order from local councils. So it gives us an opportunity to talk to them, to talk about how they manage the work that they do on behalf of us as well. And then I did mention foodborne illness reduction as well. Just to reiterate, we don't have data that would link Scores on Doors uptake and use versus reduction in people getting sick. The data doesn't tell us that, but it's just one of a suite of mechanisms that we have. And then local councils as well. Many of them doing great work. They're out there inspecting 60,000 retail food businesses in New South Wales. They're out doing that work every single day. They've got competing priorities. They've got challenges. They've got shortages of staff. They've got other priorities. But it gives them the opportunity to provide some visibility to the work that they do, because as regulators, we're out doing this work every day, and many people have never even heard of the Food Authority, for example. So people are pretty much aware of their local councils, but maybe not aware of the nature and the extent of the work that they do. So it gives them an opportunity to have some visibility of what they do. And those certificates which we print and manage, we can co-brand them as well. So a local council can have their logos on there as they wish. There's also an engagement opportunity for the local council with the food business as well. So the inspector would probably only see that food business when they're in the kitchen during service, and they're assessing them against the Food Standards Code and there's discussions undertaking that work. But this gives them another opportunity to engage with that business. And many local councils are quite deeply ingrained in their local community. And this gives them an opportunity to talk about their performance. It gives them a motivating incentive to say, well, you got 4 stars this year. You know, if you really want the 5 stars, perhaps do A, B, C, and D. We'll come back in 6 months and see how you go. And that's a little bit more of a positive slant than usually the negative undertones that go with that type of interaction. And then, of course, the food business themselves, they get the reward for strong performance. They could have an inspection where the inspector said, this is the most amazing kitchen we've ever seen. But if they're not in the scheme, they can't tell anybody that. It stops, and the business might use that to motivate the staff. But this gives them the opportunity to really reward them and say, here's 5 stars, we consider you to be excellent. Here's a certificate, you could put it up front and center of your business. You can put the stickers online, use it in your marketing information as well. So it really is a really good opportunity for them if they want to take it. We also find as well that many of those businesses want to compete with similar businesses. So they ask the inspector to come back, and say, can you inspect us again? We need to get 5 stars because old mate up the road he's got 5 stars and we need them. And of course, the question always from industry is, well, how much is this going to cost us? Well, it's not going to cost them any more than what they're paying for their inspection. They'll typically pay about $300 for an inspection. There'll be an admin fee with that as well. But there's no additional cost. It's linked to the food inspection, which is going to happen anyway. So it's kind of win-win for everybody. And then just to reiterate the point that Gabrielle made as well, informed consumers, they get, if they're aware of the scheme, then they can make decisions about where to eat as well. The next slide, please. So just some key considerations for rating systems in the context of scores on doors, but if you are a regulator and that's piqued your interest a little bit, just a couple of points there. Number 1, keep it real simple. We've got a food inspection that's going to happen. There's points accumulated that equate to corresponding scores on doors value. Align with existing regulatory activities, the inspection's happening, issue the certificate. Align with strategic objectives, be clear about what the end goal is. Inform consumers, making less people sick. That's the ultimate goal. Maximise and promote the benefits to all the stakeholders. So tell local council, tell the consumers, tell the food business what potentially that might look for them. And then maintain the stakeholder awareness and understanding. If consumers don't know about it, food businesses don't know about it, the local council kind of knows about it, it's not really going to move forward and keep delivering on what it needs to deliver. So there needs to be some form of dynamic action behind the scenes to keep promoting it. I think that's the last slide, is it? That's me. Thank you.
Thanks to both Andrew and Gabrielle. We've got a few questions online. I'm going to kick us off with one though. I'm interested in your thoughts. You've talked about keeping it simple. You've talked about having an opportunity for people to understand, the consumer to understand what the rating is. But sitting behind any rating scheme needs to be a really robust methodology. And I was interested that it appeared that yours related to the more points you got, the lower the score that you got.
Yes.
Whereas really in some other rating systems, it's the more boxes you tick, the more likely you are to get a high rating. So I'm interested in how you come up with the scoring that sits under the rating that really does drive that rating system.
I'll go first. Yep. So the Food Standards Code has a number of provisions that the food business needs to meet. And the inspection checklist has those, and it also has some points that you would accumulate if there's a breach detected. So a minor one would accumulate a point, medium breach would accumulate 4 points, and a serious breach 8 points. And our cutoff is 15 points. Once you accumulate 15, you're gone. You failed your inspection. So yeah, it is. You accumulate points the more breaches that are seen. So if your inspector's not adding up when you're having your inspection, then that's a good thing. So yeah, it is. You don't accumulate points. The science behind that again is just looking at a risk-based approach. So the stronger the breach, the higher the risk to food safety.
Which is quite different, Gabrielle, to the early childhood system where it's not about breaching or compliance. The rating component is a part of an assessment.
Yeah, but yes, of course. And Andrew's point about it, there's a continuum for any regulator. You go in there and it may be that you're just doing a monitoring visit or a checkup visit, and you might see something that concerns you. And that can lead to the regulatory authority to come back and do another assessment. Because we just assume that everyone is working to do the best they can and to really take to heart the principle of continuous quality improvement. But things change, And we see exactly as you do, Andrew, that something can change. A director of a service may leave, and you'll have new staff, and that's of course one of the realities of living in Australia is that there's not a sector that I've ever heard of it, in the last couple of years that doesn't have a workforce shortage issue. And so one of the things that we do look for, and when I say we, I'm talking about the 8 regulatory authorities that we work together very closely with. So we have a regulatory practice committee where we meet and we talk about what's happening right across Australia. But we know that there are risk indicators that would say that we need to go back into that service, or the regulatory authority needs to go back into that service, and to check that the rating is still current. And so I won't go into what they are, but the 7 national quality areas of the National Quality Standard have things like program and practice, because remember it's an education sector. So we look at pedagogy and practice, we look at the environment, we look at the relationships between the educators, teachers and parents, we look at the leadership. And what we found in the research that we've been doing since we've been collecting the data about how ratings are going, there's a very, very strong relationship between the quality of the program and the leadership. And I would say that that's probably exactly the same in every regulator sector, in every market. And the other thing I would mention, that I forgot to mention before, is that the rating is only good if it's independent. So I've heard over and over again markets saying they should just do their own regulation and their own rating, and that's worth nothing. So it really does have to have that independence.
Okay, I've got a bunch of questions coming through. I'm going to try and join some of them up. So I've got 2 here. One is there a right of review for regulated entities? And the one that's associated is, what are your processes when you're challenged by the business on the score you've given them? Andrew, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, there's a point in time inspection, and what we ask the inspector to do is to make those observations as they go around. So generally when they get to the end of the inspection, there shouldn't really be any crazy surprises. If the food business is quite engaged, then they really should know what stage they're coming to. For the Scores on Doors scheme, I did mention that we have instances where the food business would like to challenge. They want to get a better score for whatever reason. And there is a right of review. We do have some guidelines that we issue to local councils. And if the food business wanted to challenge that, they could even pay for another inspection. But generally, the food standards inspection would take precedent over the Scores on Doors component of it. And we would hope that, as I say, there's enough engagement through the inspection process and any activity that happens after the event that both parties are quite aware, and there's enough transparency there to identify why they got to that end point. We would always ask local councils, though, if there was a bone of contention, that they would have that justice component, whereby that they could, discuss that with their business. There is the opportunity, and it has happened before, where a food business will pay for an additional inspection to see if they can improve, and it's up to the local council if they think that's valid and fair.
So the National Quality Framework has to operate under administrative law, so it has to be fair, it has to be just, it has to be reasonable. So a service that is disgruntled because they didn't get the rating that they expected, they could go to the regulatory authority in the first instance. It's called first tier review, and they can ask the regulatory authority to relook at the evidence. If they are not happy with the regulatory authority, then they can come to a CEQA, and it's called second tier review. And we have an independent panel, it's not made up of CEQA staff, an independent panel from all over Australia, and they only will look at the evidence that the regulatory authority looked at. So they cannot take on new material, etc., etc. And we have found something terribly interesting was that we developed a self-assessment tool with New South Wales. And we found that since the self-assessment tool, we've been encouraging services to use that before they have an assessment and rating visit. And what we found is that the number of at least second-tier reviews, if not first-tier reviews, has really diminished because they have to justify to themselves, first of all, when they do the self-assessment before they get the independent authorised officer in.
Gabrielle, this is probably a good one for you. This person's interested in further evaluation of the benefits realised or the impacts of having these rating systems, particularly on the ultimate beneficiaries. So I know that ANZSOG does regular surveys of parents to understand the take-up. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
So it's really interesting because I've always considered that the National Quality Framework and the National Quality Standards, the recipient is the child. And so I've always believed that, the components that create the National Quality Standard are based on evidence about what works in education. And so, and of course, a lot of that science has come also from neuroscience and from the things that we've learned about how children learn language, for example. And so, the rating that is given as service is very clear about the value that the child is getting from that service, as well as the parents. Is it a clean environment? Is it, does it look at the child's social development, their language development, their physical development? And so it's quite complex, but it's all based on international research for over 100 years about what helps to children to learn and to develop. And so I've forgotten the question. ANZSOG's role is also to do an evaluation of, is it having an impact on children as well as does it have an impact on families' choices? And we know that families are getting much more astute and much more canny about what they do. So we have a family survey. And the interesting thing about even the families who choose the service but they don't know about the rating will always say to us, we just assumed that it would be high quality because we believe that, in Australia, our school and our early childhood education and care systems are high class.
All right, Andrew, I've got one for you. This questioner says there's quite a few, it's just jumped off the screen, that's quite unhelpful. There's quite a few food businesses or suppliers that operate across various jurisdictions. So does New South Wales Food Authority use a collaborative approach with other state regulators to reduce the burden of regulation, for example, auditing or checking businesses, or do you share intelligence across other regulators?
Yeah, good question. I mean, their remit is New South Wales only. So certainly for looking at the rating system is the retail sector. So what we do in that space is it's a state-based program. But we do work with we work closely with the other state regulators. We have regular meetings and a number of initiatives to set policy and set work. But when you look at the rating system, that is just one measure of many, and it's not something that we take to the country really. We do have comparable schemes in the other jurisdictions, and for example, South Australia were in contact with us 3-4 years ago, South Australian Department of Health, to develop their own Scores on Doors program. So we work with them and we share materials and explain to them what we do and provide advice about what we think would work well. And then they can develop their own program. So we certainly don't keep it to ourselves. We do share. We share the materials. We work together, and certainly intelligence in terms of trend analysis is shared at a high level.
Gabrielle, maybe this one's for you. Does the user or consumer experience contribute to the rating, or is it only developed on compliance and formal measures?
Part of the National Quality Standard is the requirement for the service to have a very close relationship with the family and the community. And so, we are seeing more and more now that we're 10 years since the National Quality Framework started. We're seeing more and more authorised officers want to see evidence of the close relationship with families and with children and with the community. And so they will look to see, what evidence there is in the service that they have enabled and ensured that parents and children have had a voice in the, for example, the policies, the procedures, the environment, and the learning program. And so our authorised officers are very clever and very smart about seeing the things that are really embedded and are really in practice, and not just a gloss for the visit that they happen to be there that day.
Gabrielle, you talked about the framework that's in place to make sure that all of those assessors, have the level of capability required. Can you also maybe share with us that there's a process of moderating and making sure there's consistency? Can you tell us about that, given that it's operated by 8 different regulators?
Sure. So as I mentioned, the authorised officers are employed by each state and territory regulatory authority, but before they're authorised to undertake an assessment and rating, we train them. And so that is a very intense program where they, over COVID, we did it online over 4 days, but normally it would be face-to-face. And we try and mix up the training, so authorised officers from all the states and territories get together, because that's part of the community of practice and part of learning. After they finish their training, they must do a test, and that's a reliability test. And if they don't pass the test and they get 3 goes at it, they cannot undertake assessment and rating. On top of that, once they have passed the test and they start to undertake the assessment and rating, most regulatory authorities make sure that authorised officer goes with an experienced authorised officer at least in the initial period where they are going into a service and undertaking that assessment and rating. And then on top of that, every year they must sit what we call a drift test. So we give them all sorts of scenarios and we give them all sorts of experiences, and we want to make sure that at the end of that annual drift test that they're still reliable, that we know that a family living in Darwin, for example, sees a sign on the door saying that service is an exceeding service. They know that that's true, and also for the family who happen to be in Hobart. So we have a national program, and on top of that, of course, those authorised officers meet frequently. We have what's called a lead assessor network, as well as the regulatory practice committee, where we talk about emerging issues and how do we cope with that. And I can say that on top of all of that, the assessment and rating, we do a quarterly snapshot. So we inform governments and the public that this is what's happening in every state and territory, and we break it down by service type. So whether it's a long day care, a kindergarten, preschool, a family daycare, after school hours care service. And we also have a look at how that's progressing, because remember, one of the C's that we've got is that continuous quality improvement.
Okay. Andrew, I might get you to have a go at this one. So it says we've heard a lot about the positives.
Yep.
What about the costs and the risks of introducing a rating system?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in terms of scores on doors, I mean, one of my key points was, if you're going to introduce a rating system, align it with existing regulatory activities. So that's one of the why we don't need to pass on any costs to the business at the end of the day. So that's one of the key points in the success of the program, being that the food inspector's already out there. They've got the FPAR, the Food Premises Assessment Report. It's linked to the legislation, and they're in there. So I suppose you want to see what your end goal is. What's the strategic objective that you want to do? And then it would be the cost benefit to you introducing the scheme. For us, it was just one measure, a part of a whole suite of different initiatives and programs that we run. So it made sense to tag it onto the inspection. We make it as easy as possible for our local councils who actually implement the program, because we design and we print all the certificates. The reason we do that is we want to control the quality of it. There is a bit of a push to have it online or to let the business print it themselves. but we felt there's too much of a risk there for us in terms of the quality of what that visual will look like. So we print them, and local councils will get in contact with us, and they will order those certificates and those stickers, and then we will send them to them. I do appreciate for some councils who don't issue the certificate at the time of the inspection, there is some cost in terms of administration. They'll have to write up the certificate or print the certificate, whatever they're doing, and the stickers, and they sometimes would post them. So there's obviously someone has to do that, and then there's postal costs that sit behind that. But on the grand scale of things, when you're looking at 47,000 businesses that are captured by the scheme or whatever it was, I don't remember, we're getting that reduction in foodborne illness, we're getting that engagement with businesses, the motivating factor, we're getting all these supplementary benefits, the incentives for everybody that sit behind that. So yeah, I suppose the answer is align it with existing activities to minimise your costs.
Gabrielle, any thoughts?
My warning is be careful because it's expensive, and the National Quality Framework, the 8 governments pay for assessment and rating is the short answer. And you know what seemed like a great idea, and I still think it's a wonderful rating system. But you know, 10 years ago we had X number of services. The number of services keep rising, and that means that every regulatory authority in Australia, and I'm looking at my regulatory colleagues in the room, that cost is still borne, and it's not able to be controlled because the assessment and rating, because it is funded by the 8 governments, you have to keep meeting demand, and that means that there's no end in sight. You know, as long as the services keep multiplying and becoming more diverse and becoming trickier, the harder it is to make sure that we continue the program. And that begs the question of how often should an assessment or rating be undertaken. And it's fascinating because we haven't found any evidence around the world, particularly in education, that there is an ideal time because the sector is so dynamic. And what we have to do is to say that we do our best, but we'll take a risk-based approach. But it's expensive.
It does link with the next question, which is what follow-up do you do with providers that have low ratings? Because it did remind me, I did used to sit in early childhood, that in New South Wales, when we did have a really significant cohort that were rated significant improvement required, that was actually a way to help exit unscrupulous providers from the market. So it was one of the levers that the government was able to use to think about who they wanted in the market. So what do you do when there's a service that's rated low quality, Andrew? What's the follow-up?
Well, the follow-up is if you accumulate more than 15 points in an inspection, then there's an inspection failure. There needs to be, and our expectation of local councils would be there's some form of regulatory action on the back of that. The Food Act provides for an improvement notice, so that the business is given a set number of days, 30 days, whatever the case may be, and that would depend on the seriousness of the breach. If there was a real risk of people getting ill, there's a lack of skills and knowledge, there's an accumulation of dirt, filth, there's rodent activity evidence, there can be an improvement notice, or for more serious breaches, a prohibition order, which effectively could close a business as well, which is a real good motivator to get action from a business if they can't trade at all. So there's some real strong action that can be taken under the Food Act, and we're pretty lucky in that respect. So number one, there needs to be some form of follow-up action from local council. It could be an improvement notice or prohibition order, it could be a warning letter, but there needs to be a secondary inspection, and that will be determined depending on the risk to public health, I suppose. Once that follow-up inspection is undertaken, there'll be an assessment against what was asked at the time, and again, if that's not be complied with, it's stronger action. So it could be a penalty notice, it could be prosecution, escalate to prohibition order if it was an improvement notice, and then you can force that business to make those rectifications. So hopefully quite a linear approach. Doesn't always work that way depending on what happens out in the real world, but on paper that's the intent.
Gabrielle, did you want to add something around how?
I think that that's universal. You know, if you're going to rate as a regulator, you have to have all the tools and to be able to take action very quickly depending on what you see. But I can say that, you know, our lowest rating is significant improvement required. There's one service at the moment out of over 16,000 that is rated as significant improvement required. Having said that, however, a regulatory authority can move very quickly. Doesn't matter what the rating of that service is, if there's any hint that there's you know, danger to a child or to children, and of course exactly that, you know, a whole array of powers right down to closure.
There's a couple of questions that link to that point. So one asking, you know, the rating scale seems to typically be developed based on retrospective data. Is there any consideration of predictive analysis? And then also, has either agency developed an early warning system where there is a likelihood that there might be significant non-compliances in the space? So how are you using the data and the insight that is being gained to think about and anticipate where things might go?
Wow.
I can start. So you know, I mentioned the indicators of risk. You know, so that's probably something that is, you know, forward thinking. If we hear that a service has just been sold, and we keep a pretty close eye on the approved providers who run these services, if we think that there's something going on or we started to see a pattern, and that pattern can be seen because a lot of the providers in Australia are national providers. If we start to see something in one service, regardless of where it is in Australia, we share that information, and we want to know, we keep a very close eye on that provider, or indeed, you know, there'll be other indications like complaints. You know, if we hear a complaint or we start to see a high turnover of staff, they're all indicators of having another closer look. But at the time that we do an assessment or rating, we go in there, regulatory authorities, authorised officers go in there, and they can see, they can be there in real time. And what's interesting is that always it's been available not to give notice about coming in, but historically in Australia for the National Quality Framework, regulatory authorities gave services notice about their visits. Now we're in the second decade of the National Quality Framework. That period of time is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, so that parents know that these are real indicators of what's happening now.
And from the food perspective, we look at the risk of food handling. So, for example, there's a real link between raw egg use, making raw egg mayonnaise, for example. In the summer months, it's been left out, pathogens start to grow. People get sick from that. So we use the trend in the data from New South Wales health colleagues who tell us we can then look at the types of food and the settings that may cause that type of outbreak. And it's not so much that we can predict individual businesses and how they will go, but what we can do is we can pull the lever and ask all our authorised officers to look for any food businesses that handle and use raw eggs, for example, and really target on them and ask them, show us what you do. Are you washing your hands? Are you disposing of the eggs? Is there an alternative that you can use, a pasteurised egg of some sort? Are you going to cook the product? Could you cook the product? Could you add some vinegar into your mayonnaise to get the acid in there, which helps as well? So it's more looking at the trend, the data from people getting sick, and looking at the industry and subsectors that maybe, you know, the raw eggs has been one example, where we can really target our resources where they need to be.
And then there's a question about how much information you give back to the regulated entity once you've done the assessment or the rating. So what are they seeing, or are they just seeing something that's pretty high level?
Well, in the food space, they get a copy of the inspection report, and it should not be fresh news to them, whatever is in there, because generally it's done in collaboration as they walk around the business. If they're in Scores on Doors, they get the certificate, or they'll get the promise of the certificate at a later date as well. So they are given that information, they got full visibility of.
Yeah, and the National Quality Framework is based on the principle that, you know, we all share continuous quality improvement. And so, regulatory authorities in ASICWA, we do a lot to work with services to help them to understand where they can improve and how. And, that includes, professional development, information sheets. Of course, they get the assessment and rating report. But going in, it's not just, you're failed at that, or you could, this is terrible. It's really taking them along how do they improve it, and what do they need to do to make sure that, they're meeting the national quality area or the elements of that area.
Okay, and last question, we'll end with an easy one. So I've got a couple of people that have indicated that they're thinking about introducing a rating system, or it's been agreed that they're going to introduce one. They want to know what your key tips are as they go forward.
Keep it simple so that the relevant stakeholders have a good understanding of it. I did mention if you don't keep moving with that continual promotion of it and promote the benefits to all the stakeholders, then it's going to slow. So if you want to keep that momentum and introduce it, make sure that you understand the benefits and promote that to the relevant sort of profiles, consumers, the business, whatever the case may be. Keep it simple and also link it to existing activities as well.
My 7 sticky notes are the way to really think about that. But I'd also say one other thing is that the culture of your regulators, because what we found before the National Quality Framework, they were a culture deeply embedded psyche of going into a service and just being friends. To be a rater, you have to step back and you have to be hard-nosed, and that's a different kettle of fish.
All right. Well, that's all the questions we've got time for today. As we said, we'll try and categorise those or theme them and come back to you with some answers and some resources and some ideas about where you can go to if you want more information. I want to say a big thank you to our speakers today, our in-person audience here in the room, and also all of you online who have joined us. If you've joined one of these sessions before, a National Regulators Community of Practice session, you'll know that you're going to get a follow-up short survey. We'd really love you to complete that. It helps us determine what other events that we should put on and how we can continue to grow the network of regulators that we have right across the country. It's a pretty special week this week because NRCOP is standing up our Darwin or our NT chapter. So there is a second event this week which is called Holding the Regulatory Line. So if you work for a regulator that has staff based up in the Territory, like I do, encourage your staff to head along there. That's on Friday this week. I also want to take this opportunity to do a short plug for what has been an enormous piece of work undertaken by ANZSOG and the National Regulators Community of Practice to develop the Professional Regulator Professional Development Program. If you haven't already had a look, please do so. A number of us were lucky enough to have people participate in the pilot earlier this year. The pilot was very successful with fantastic feedback. I know staff from the Commission took quite a lot out of that program, and in fact we've now offered it to a large number of our staff in the Commission. I'd really encourage you to have a look at that, and it is a great way for us to build systemic capacity of regulators across the country. And my last plug is for the conference. If you haven't seen information about that, it's towards the end of September in Melbourne. We've got Malcolm Sparrow, he's coming back again. He's going to be there across the couple of days, and Adele Ferguson is also one of the other key speakers that we have. So please pop online and register if you haven't already. We'll keep all the details on the socials that we've got for NRCOP. Thanks again for coming along today.